He left her at the altar with no explanation. But years later, the truth came back to knock on her door. Emily rebuilt her life from the ashes, found love again, and finally faced the man who shattered her world, only to uncover a secret that changed everything. Who was he protecting, and why? This isn't just a story about heartbreak. It's about survival, forgiveness, and choosing love again. Where are you watching from? Subscribe now for more powerful true stories like this. Emily Clark woke before the sun, the pale gray light barely seeping through the curtains of the coastal inn where she and her closest friends had spent the night. The morning air was still, suspended between silence and anticipation. Today was her wedding day, and despite the dreams she'd had since she was a teenager, visions of white lace and violins and the man of her dreams waiting at the end of the aisle, nothing in those daydreams had prepared her for the gravity of this moment. The sheets were cool against her skin, her pulse steady but buzzing beneath the surface. She lay still, listening to the soft rustling of ocean wind against the old wooden windows. She could hear faint footsteps down the hallway and the occasional burst of laughter. Her bridesmaids were already up. But Emily lingered a moment longer in the hush of morning, letting it wash over her like a baptism before everything changed. There was a knock. "Em?" came Maya's voice, her best friend since college. "Time to get gorgeous." Emily sat up, pushing her auburn curls back from her face, and exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her room slowly filled with warm golden light as the curtains parted. The air smelled like lavender and sea salt, and everything felt unreal, like a movie scene that didn't quite belong to her. Maya entered with a flurry of robes, coffee, and energy that was equal parts comforting and overwhelming. "Bridezilla mode activated yet?" she teased. "Not even close," Emily said, though her voice wavered. She wasn't nervous about marrying Jason. At least, not in the way people expected. Jason Rivera had been her rock, her calm in every storm. They met at a fundraiser for a local housing initiative. He had just opened his own architectural firm, and she was already deep in her work as a social worker for underserved families. Their love hadn't been fireworks. It had been a slow-burning warmth, steady and real. He grounded her, loved her in a quiet way that always made her feel safe. Still, there was something this morning, something under the surface, a flicker she couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even doubt. It was more like an echo. Like some part of her soul knew something wasn't quite right. Her mother arrived a few minutes later, clutching the gold bracelet Emily's grandmother had worn on her wedding day. She fastened it around Emily's wrist with hands that trembled slightly. "You look just like her," she said, tears brimming in her eyes. "She would have been so proud of you." Emily smiled, blinked back the sting in her own eyes. "Thanks, Mom." As the morning unfolded, the suite transformed into a whirlwind of silk dresses, foundation brushes, curling irons, and champagne flutes. Maya adjusted Emily's veil 3 times, fussing over every fold and curl like her life depended on it. Emily's father, always the stoic one, peeked in, teared up instantly, and had to excuse himself before he completely fell apart. When it was finally time, Emily stepped into the small sunroom where the ceremony was to be held. The space was breathtaking. Arched glass windows that looked out over the sea, sunlight pouring in across the white rose petals lining the aisle. Jason had wanted a simple venue, something modern and clean. Emily had wanted something intimate. Somehow they'd found the perfect in-between. Guests filled the room. Some she knew well. Her co-workers, her college roommates, Jason's childhood friends, and others She'd met only briefly during their engagement dinners. They were all dressed in soft shades of blue and gray, the color scheme Jason had picked to match the coast. Every detail had been carefully planned. Everything was perfect. Except that flicker was still there. She stood at the entrance, her arm looped through her father's. Ahead, Jason stood in a tailored navy suit, his dark hair neatly styled, his hands clasped in front of him. His eyes found hers the second she appeared. His face softened, a small smile forming. But it didn't reach his eyes. There was something about the way he looked at her, a sadness she hadn't seen before. Emily forced her feet to move, step by step down the aisle, past rows of smiling faces and flashing cameras. Maya winked at her from the front row. Jason's best man, David, gave her a nervous thumbs up. Her father squeezed her hand just before handing her off, then stepped back. Now it was just her and Jason. The officiant began to speak, her voice a comforting hum in the background. Jason reached for Emily's hand. His palm was clammy. She smiled anyway. Maybe it was just nerves. It had to be. The vows began. Jason's voice was quiet but steady. He spoke of their first late-night conversation, their shared dreams of building something lasting, his awe at her resilience and compassion. Emily's heart ached with the tenderness of his words. When it was her turn, her voice trembled as she promised to love him through every storm, to trust him even when it was hard, to never stop believing in the future they would create. And then, just before the final words, just before they were to be pronounced, husband and wife, Jason's hand slipped from hers. Emily blinked. Jason took a step back. The officiant faltered, looking between them. Jason's lips moved. She saw him say something, but the words were swallowed by the quiet gasp of the audience. Then he turned and walked away. At first, Emily couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even think. It didn't register until the sound of chairs scraping back, whispers growing louder, cameras flashing again, but this time not in celebration. Her father stepped forward, confused. Maya rushed toward her, her face pale. "Emily? Emily, what the hell just happened?" She had no answer, because the truth was, Jason was gone. Just gone. Out the doors, past the guests, down the hall. No explanation, no apology, no reason. Emily stood frozen at the altar, the train of her dress pooling around her feet, her bouquet slipping from her hands. The room spun. Voices blurred into static. Every heartbeat was like a drumbeat in her ears. Someone ushered her off to the side. Maya wrapped an arm around her, shielding her from the growing chaos. David was on the phone, pacing. "I don't know where he went. He left." The coordinator whispered something about postponing the reception. Emily didn't speak. She couldn't. The next hour passed like a fever dream. Emily sat alone in a small dressing room, staring at her reflection. Her mascara had smudged. Her lips were trembling. Her chest burned with confusion and shame. Maya returned, shaking her head. "He's not at the hotel. His phone's off. No one can find him." Emily's mother knocked softly, came in and sat beside her. "I don't understand," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Neither did Emily. And when Maya tried to convince her to take off the dress, to wash her face, to leave this place, Emily refused. She stayed. She stayed long after the guests left, long after the sun began to set. She sat in the same chair, the same wedding gown, waiting for something, anything, to make sense. But it never did. When night fell over the inn and the only sound was the crashing of waves against the shore, Emily was still there, staring at the door where Jason had vanished. The headlines came before she even made it home. Emily barely remembered how she got back to her apartment that night. One moment she was sitting alone in the hushed bridal suite, the smell of roses and disappointment thick in the air, and the next she was in her living room, still in her wedding dress, staring blankly at the television screen, which flickered with a local news broadcast. Her phone buzzed incessantly beside her, a cruel staccato beat, texts, missed calls, voicemails, even media inquiries. She didn't touch it. Didn't move. Her dress, once pristine, was now wrinkled and heavy, like it had absorbed the weight of her humiliation. A video clip appeared on the screen, blurry, shaky, but unmistakable. It was her, standing at the altar, alone. Then the footage jumped. Jason's silhouette walking briskly out of the frame. The voiceover spoke with the kind of detached curiosity reserved for a scandal, not tragedy. "Runaway groom in a coastal fairy tale gone wrong," the reporter said, almost gleefully. "Sources confirm architect Jason Rivera left bride-to-be Emily Clark during their ceremony. No word yet on why." She turned the TV off. The silence that followed was deafening. By morning, her inbox was flooded. Family, friends, co-workers, even people she hadn't spoken to in years, high school acquaintances, old college roommates, offering half-hearted condolences or fishing for details under the guise of sympathy. Some messages were kind, others grotesquely curious. A few were passive-aggressive, thinly veiled attempts to understand what she had done wrong. Maya was the first to show up in person. She didn't knock, just entered using the emergency key she'd never returned and wrapped Emily in a wordless hug. They sat on the couch together for an hour without saying a thing. Maya made tea. Emily didn't drink it. Maya offered to call her parents. Emily shook her head. Maya offered to track Jason down and publicly castrate him. Emily almost smiled at that, but the muscles in her face wouldn't cooperate. By the end of the second day, the online circus was in full swing. Photos from the wedding, beautifully captured by the unfortunate professional photographer, circulated across social media. Emily in her elegant dress, glowing and hopeful. Jason, somber and distracted. The viral caption, "When forever lasts until the altar." The comments were worse. She must have cheated. Maybe he found out something about her past. I bet she wasn't who she pretended to be. Men don't just leave like that without a reason. Emily stopped reading after the first 100, but it didn't matter. They were everywhere. On her news apps, in her social media feeds. Even on the subway, she overheard strangers speculating while scrolling through the article on their phones, unaware that she was sitting 2 feet away, wearing sunglasses and hoping the floor would swallow her whole. Still, none of it prepared her for what came next. The envelope arrived on the 3rd day. Hand-delivered, no return address. At first, she thought it was another cruel message from the press or some weird fan mail from someone who got off on tragedy. But when she opened it, her stomach turned to ice. It was a notice from the city's Department of Family Services, her employer, a formal document stating that a complaint had been filed against her. The words blurred as she tried to read them again. Inappropriate behavior, boundary violations, allegations of financial coercion involving a minor. Emily froze. She'd worked at that office for 7 years. Had poured everything into helping children in impossible situations. She had spent sleepless nights advocating for teens who had no one. and now someone had accused her of manipulating them? The letter included a directive. She was being placed on immediate suspension, pending investigation. The next day, a detective called. His voice was flat and professional, but there was something in his tone, something that made Emily feel dirty, cornered. "Miss Clark, this is Detective Harrow with the Boston Police Department. We've received an anonymous complaint regarding potential misconduct in your role as a social worker. We understand the allegations may be difficult to hear, but we are obligated to follow up." Emily's blood roared in her ears. "This isn't real," she whispered. I would never." "We're not making assumptions, ma'am," he said calmly. "But we will need to review your case history and schedule a meeting with the Internal Review Board." She hung up. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Maya was back within the hour, this time with grocery bags and the kind of fury only a best friend could wield. "This is an attack," Maya said, pacing across the kitchen. "This isn't just a breakup. Someone is trying to destroy you." I don't understand," Emily whispered. "Why now? Why like this?" "Because you're vulnerable," Maya snapped. "Because someone knows exactly where to hit you." And then they both went quiet. Because there was only one person who had ever known Emily's professional life that intimately. Only one person who could have gotten access to names, cases, the kind of private information that made the false claims sound plausible. Jason. But why? The betrayal coiled in Emily's chest like barbed wire. Was it a final act of cruelty, or had someone else, someone with more power, put him up to it? In the days that followed, Emily's world continued to implode. Her face became synonymous with the scandal. Tabloids ran headlines like "Runaway Groom's Bride Under Investigation" and "Too Good to Be True." Local news picked it up. Former clients didn't return her calls. Parents pulled their kids from programs she'd once overseen. The foundation of everything she'd built began to crack, and she had no idea how to stop it. Her parents called, dozens of times. Her father left tearful voicemails. Her mother's messages were clipped, her voice trembling with concern and confusion. But Emily couldn't bear to face them, couldn't imagine looking into their eyes and seeing pity. So she stayed inside, curtains drawn, phone silenced, wearing the same sweater for days. The wedding dress hung in the closet, still wrapped in the plastic from the cleaners, as if mocking her with its untouched perfection. Maya came daily, bringing food, forcing Emily to shower, to eat, to speak. She tried everything to pull her friend out of the void. But Emily remained locked in place, stuck in that moment at the altar when the world split in two. And then, one night, one awful electric night, the fire alarm went off in the building. Just a test. But it jolted Emily from the couch, heart pounding, breath short. She rushed into the hallway barefoot, surrounded by neighbors she hadn't spoken to in weeks. They stared. Someone whispered her name. Someone else took a picture. She bolted. Later, curled up in the corner of her bedroom, she finally cracked. "I can't do this," she told Maya through tears. "I can't live like this." "You don't have to," Maya said gently, brushing Emily's hair from her face. "But you do have to decide whether you're going to let him win." Emily didn't answer. Not that night. But something settled in her chest. Not quite clarity, not quite strength, but the ember of something like defiance. She had lost her fiancé, her reputation, maybe even her career. But she hadn't lost herself. Not yet. The days that followed became indistinguishable from one another, a slow descent into numbness. Emily moved through them like a ghost haunting her own life. The sunlight filtering through her apartment windows no longer held warmth. Meals were forgotten or barely touched. Time passed, but she couldn't feel it. Every ticking second echoed too loudly in the quiet, reminding her of everything she'd lost, her dignity, her identity, her future. Each morning she woke hoping the nightmare had somehow unraveled itself overnight, that she would open her eyes and find Jason beside her, smiling, ready to laugh off the worst prank in history. But there was no laughter, no Jason, only the cold imprint of her mistakes. The official investigation moved forward. Her lawyer, a calm woman named Janine, reassured her that the complaint had no grounds. "We'll clear this up," she said. "It's just red tape." "Someone is trying to scare you." Emily nodded, but the fear was already there, blooming like mold in her chest. Even the truth felt flimsy now. Even her own memories started to unravel. Was there anything she could have done differently? Had she ignored red flags, missed signs? She remembered one night, months before the wedding, when Jason had seemed off, distant. He'd told her work was overwhelming, that he was dealing with pressure from his parents about their financial investments. She'd believed him. Why wouldn't she? He was the man she trusted most in the world. He had always been steady, attentive, protective. The type to hold her hand even in silence, to bring her tea when she worked late, to kiss her shoulder when he thought she was asleep. How could that man disappear so completely? Her mother arrived one afternoon without warning. Emily had been lying on the couch in the same hoodie for 3 days. She didn't even remember buzzing her in. The door creaked open. "Emily?" her mother called softly. Then, a pause. "Oh, baby." Emily didn't look at her, didn't speak. She just turned her face into the pillow, ashamed of how far she had sunk. Her mother sat beside her, smoothing her hair like she used to when Emily was a child with a fever. "You can't stay like this. I know it hurts, sweetheart, but this isn't who you are." "I don't know who I am anymore," Emily said, her voice barely audible. "You're my daughter," her mother said gently. "You're brave and strong, and you don't let men like him take everything from you." But hadn't she? Hadn't Jason taken everything? Emily wished she could tell her mother about the panic attacks that hit without warning, about how her heart raced when she heard Jason's name on the news, or how the mere idea of stepping outside made her feel exposed and raw. But she couldn't speak those truths aloud. Not yet. Later that evening, after her mother left, Emily opened her laptop, more out of habit than purpose, and found her inbox flooded with headlines. Jason Rivera spotted with Victoria Hale. Runaway groom rekindles romance with billionaire heiress. Victoria Hale, the same woman Emily knew Jason had dated before they ever met. The same Victoria who once smiled at Emily with teeth too white and eyes too calculating during a charity gala. The same woman whose family owned half the city's skyline and treated everyone else like props in their social theater. Emily stared at the photo. Jason and Victoria, hand in hand, stepping out of a private car like a royal couple. Jason looked tired, thinner, but he was smiling. Not the gentle, soft smile she remembered. This one was sharper, performative, like a man who'd accepted the mask he was asked to wear. Her stomach churned. So that's what this was? He'd gone back to her? After everything? The betrayal took on a new shape, no longer just personal, but strategic, as if Emily had been a placeholder, a warm-up act before the real show. And Victoria? She didn't just want Jason, she wanted to destroy Emily in the process. Maya confirmed the suspicion the next day. "I made a few calls," she said, dropping onto the couch beside Emily with a paper coffee cup and fire in her eyes. "Victoria's father has connections everywhere: lawyers, judges, donors, board members. If she wanted to tank your career, she wouldn't have to break a sweat." "Why?" Emily asked. Her voice was hoarse from disuse. "Why would she care that much?" Maya hesitated. "Because Jason cared about you, and she couldn't stand it." Emily wanted to scream, to tear something apart, but all she could do was sit there, staring at the blank wall across from her. She felt like a vase that had been shattered and glued back together with shaky hands. Still standing, but fragile in ways no one could see. She started therapy the next week. Maya booked it without asking. Emily hadn't wanted to go at first, but after her third panic attack in the shower, she agreed. Her therapist, a soft-spoken woman named Rochelle, never asked questions Emily wasn't ready to answer. She just sat with her, gently encouraging her to peel back the layers. It took weeks for Emily to say Jason's name out loud. It took longer to admit that she still missed him. That was the worst part, the grief. It wasn't just the humiliation. It was the fact that she still woke up thinking about him, still reached for her phone expecting to see his good morning texts, still waited for the sound of his keys in the door, even though she knew he wasn't coming back. The mind plays cruel tricks on a broken heart. The suspension from her job dragged on. The investigation remained open. She couldn't work, couldn't help anyone. All she could do was wait. And so she wrote. Not about the scandal, not about Jason, but about her clients. The children she used to counsel. The women she'd helped escape abuse. She wrote their stories, anonymous, protected, just to remember why she had started this work in the first place, to remind herself that she was good at something, that she had mattered once. One night, she stayed up writing until 3 a.m., her fingers cramping, her eyes stinging. But she didn't stop. For the first time in months, she felt something close to alive. And then, as if the universe had finally exhaled, the call came. Janine's voice was calm. "The board cleared you, Emily. The complaint was deemed malicious, with no supporting evidence. You're free to return to work." Emily let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped in her lungs for years. But when she hung up the phone, she didn't feel victorious. She felt empty, because the damage was already done. Her name had been dragged through the mud, her reputation bruised, her confidence shattered. And the worst part, the part no one understood, she no longer trusted herself. She returned to work 2 weeks later, walking through the front doors of the center like someone stepping onto cracked ice. The receptionist offered her a kind smile, too sympathetic. Her colleagues greeted her with guarded warmth. She could feel the whispers behind their smiles, the sideways glances. No one said it out loud, but she could hear it in their eyes. Is she stable enough to be here? She did her job, efficiently, professionally. But she stopped staying late, stopped taking on the hardest cases, stopped getting close to her clients in the way she used to. She built walls, quiet ones, invisible but impenetrable. She smiled when expected, laughed when necessary, but she never let anyone too close, never gave them a chance to hurt her again. And yet, somewhere beneath it all, something stirred. A question, a whisper, What if I built something they can't take from me? Something new. Something that didn't rely on public approval or fragile systems. It started as a thought, then a journal entry, then a business plan, drafted in the margins of old case files. She would build a foundation, one that offered shelter, therapy, and legal support to women and children who had been manipulated, discarded, or betrayed. Not just for them, for herself. Because maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end. Maybe it was the beginning of something else, something stronger, something no one could take away from her ever again. The office space was small, just 2 rooms and a break area that smelled vaguely of old paint and fresh ambition, but to Emily it felt like a palace. The walls were bare, the floors scuffed, the ceiling lights flickered sometimes, but it was hers. A lease signed in her name, funded with her savings and a modest grant Maya had helped her apply for. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. The Bennett Foundation for Empowerment and Support didn't start with a ribbon cutting or press release. There were no photographers, no media stories, no Instagram influencers. Just Emily, Maya, 2 retired social workers she'd convinced to come out of early retirement, and a pile of mismatched furniture donated from friends and nonprofits that believed in her. Her first day, she stood at the front desk with a paper nameplate that read Director and a mug of lukewarm coffee, wondering if anyone would show up. They did. A woman named Carla came in with 2 children, looking like she hadn't slept in weeks. A man had put his hands on her again, and this time she couldn't stay. Emily brought her into the intake room and sat across from her, gently holding her gaze while Carla recounted her story. No notes, no clipboard, just listening. Later, when Carla left with a referral to housing and an appointment with one of their counselors, Emily stayed behind and cried in the bathroom. Not because of sadness, but because for the first time in a long while, she felt useful again. Solid. Like maybe she wasn't just surviving anymore. In the months that followed, word spread. Quietly but steadily, women found them, mothers, daughters, partners, women who had been lied to, manipulated, left behind, women who had learned how to disappear into silence. Emily opened the door for each one, her voice steady, her smile real. The foundation became a place where the broken didn't need to explain themselves. They were believed. They were seen. She poured herself into the work. Long days turned into longer nights. She drafted policies, chased donors, managed cases, built partnerships. Maya called her a force of nature. Emily only smiled in response. She didn't feel like a force. She just felt like someone with too many scars to let anyone else bleed alone. Outside of work, she lived quietly. She'd moved into a smaller apartment, farther from the city, with white walls and soft light and a balcony that overlooked a quiet alley. It was peaceful, predictable, and lonely in ways she didn't admit, not even to herself. She didn't date. She didn't want to. Jason's name still lived in the shadows of her mind. Not as a wound anymore, but as a scar that ached with changes in the emotional weather. She hadn't heard from him, hadn't tried to find him. Occasionally she saw his name in passing, attached to a new project or whispered in society columns next to Victoria Hale's name, but she never read further. She told herself she didn't care. She almost believed it. It was late October when the knock came. Emily had been reviewing grant proposals in her office, sipping her 3rd cup of coffee, when her assistant buzzed in through the intercom. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "He didn't have an appointment, but he said it's about his son." Emily blinked. "Did he say his name?" "Daniel Carter. He seems tired." Emily stood, smoothing her blouse and brushing the creases from her slacks. "Send him in." The door opened, and in walked a man who looked exactly how Emily used to feel. Exhausted, stretched thin, but holding it all together by sheer will. He was tall, late 30s, with salt-touched brown hair and eyes that had seen too much. Next to him stood a boy, maybe 10 or 11, awkward and quiet. His hands jammed deep into the pockets of a worn hoodie. "Miss Clark?" the man asked. "Yes, please, come in." They sat across from her at the small table she used for client intakes. The boy didn't speak. He just stared at his sneakers while Daniel sat stiffly beside him, shoulders tight with worry. "I'm Daniel Carter," he began. "This is my son, Marcus." Emily offered a kind smile. "Nice to meet you both. What brings you here today?" Daniel hesitated, then exhaled. "My wife passed away 3 years ago. Cancer. Since then, Marcus has been struggling." Emily nodded, letting the silence give him space to continue. "He's had trouble in school, fights, anger issues. I've tried therapy, counseling, youth groups, everything. Nothing sticks. A friend of mine told me about your foundation, said you help families like mine." She softened. "We do." They spoke for almost an hour. Daniel explained the challenges of solo parenting, the fear of not being enough for his son. Marcus didn't say much, but his eyes flickered now and then, curious, listening. Emily scheduled them with one of their family counselors, gave Daniel a list of resources, and walked them out. She expected to forget about them by the next day. There were always so many names, so many stories, but she didn't. She thought about Marcus during her morning coffee, wondered if he'd sleep through the night, if Daniel had cried in the car afterward, like so many parents did. They came back the next week, and the week after. Marcus began to talk, slowly, in fragments. Daniel lingered after sessions, asking thoughtful questions, offering to help with filing or carry boxes when the staff was short-handed. He never imposed, never overstepped. He just showed up. Emily found herself looking forward to his visits. Not in the breathless, dizzy way she used to feel with Jason. This was different. Calmer, safer. They started talking after hours, about parenting, about grief, about how hard it was to keep going when the world expected you to be fine. Daniel listened without judgment, never tried to fix her, never reached for her hand too soon. He saw her. Not the broken pieces or the headlines or the reputation she had clawed back from the dirt, but her. One night they stayed late after a fundraiser, cleaning up folding chairs and leftover sandwich trays. They laughed about the center's flickering lights, about a donor who'd fallen asleep mid-speech. Emily caught herself smiling for no reason, her cheeks warm in a way she hadn't felt in years. "I'm glad I found this place," Daniel said softly, stacking napkins. "It's more than a foundation. It's a lifeline." Emily looked at him, her throat tightening. "It saved me, too," she whispered. Maya was the first to notice. "You like him," she said one afternoon, sipping coffee, across from Emily's desk. "He's a client," Emily replied quickly. Maya raised a brow. "So was every guy I dated in law school. It didn't stop me." Emily laughed, then sobered. "Huh. I'm not ready." "Then don't be ready," Maya said. "Just be open." Emily wasn't sure she could. Her heart had been closed for so long, wrapped in barbed wire and fear. But she let Daniel in, bit by bit, moment by moment. And she didn't collapse. The walls didn't crumble. Instead, something surprising happened. She started to feel whole. Not fixed, not healed, but whole, like a mosaic made of broken glass, refracting light in new ways. Emily still had nightmares sometimes, still flinched at unexpected touches or certain headlines. But when Marcus called her Miss Emily with a shy smile, or when Daniel brought her a coffee exactly the way she liked it, she felt something shift inside her. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the beginning. A beginning she'd built herself, brick by careful brick. And this time, no one could take it from her. Winter melted slowly into spring that year, as if the earth itself was reluctant to thaw. Emily felt it too, the gradual return of warmth, the tentative steps back toward something like life. It came in small, quiet ways. The first crocus pushing through the frozen ground outside the foundation, the longer streaks of golden light across her apartment floor in the early evening, the slow but undeniable realization that Daniel was becoming a part of her daily rhythm. He never forced it. That was what made it different. There were no grand gestures, no declarations of passion to sweep her off her feet. He didn't try to fix her, didn't demand parts of her she wasn't ready to give. He was just there. He remembered her tea order, fixed the broken doorknob at the foundation without being asked, and showed up to Marcus's counseling appointments early with a paperback novel tucked under his arm and an easy smile. Their friendship unfolded like a well-worn novel, slow, page by page, familiar and comforting, but layered with new depth the more she read. They started having lunch together on Thursdays. Sometimes they ate at a bench outside the center, sometimes in her office when the weather was bad. He'd bring sandwiches from a little deli nearby that made a pastrami melt so good it should have been illegal, and she'd bring lemon bars that Maya swore were the reason Emily still had friends. Their conversations shifted from parenting and case files to memories, dreams, regrets. Daniel told her about the night his wife passed, how he'd held her hand until the very end, and how Marcus hadn't cried for 3 days after. Emily told him about the time she locked herself in her apartment for a week after Jason disappeared, how Maya had found her curled on the floor, surrounded by unopened wedding gifts. She didn't speak Jason's name, but Daniel understood. He never asked for details, never probed. One afternoon in early April, Marcus brought Emily a handmade card, crayon drawings of stars and planets, and in the center, a figure that was unmistakably her. Wild red hair, glasses, and a cape. "You're like a superhero," Marcus explained, cheeks reddening, "but like a quiet one. The kind that listens." Emily had to blink back tears. Later that day, Daniel lingered after Marcus's session. They stood outside the foundation, watching the boy kick pebbles along the sidewalk while waiting for the card to unlock. "He talks about you a lot," Daniel said. Emily looked over, surprised. Daniel smiled, hands in his jacket pockets. "Says you make things feel less heavy. That's big, for him." She didn't know what to say to that. She just nodded, heart pounding in her chest for reasons she didn't fully understand yet. It wasn't until mid-May, during a community picnic hosted by the foundation, that everything began to shift. They were sitting on a checkered blanket beneath a willow tree, watching kids play tag while volunteers handed out sandwiches and juice boxes. Emily laughed at something Daniel said, a dry joke about board meetings being the adult version of detention, and for the first time in years her laughter didn't feel forced. It didn't catch in her throat like it had to claw its way out. It was just easy. When she turned to look at him, he was already watching her. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. That night, back in her apartment, She stood by the window long after the sun had set, the night breeze brushing her skin. She felt something terrifying and exhilarating settle in her chest. She was falling, slowly, cautiously, but undeniably, and that scared her more than anything. The next few weeks passed like a dream wrapped in real life. She and Daniel grew closer. Still no labels, no pressure, but there was a tenderness between them that neither denied. They shared stories like secrets, leaned on each other like bookends. Emily still hadn't touched the wedding dress hanging in the back of her closet. It remained wrapped in plastic, stuffed behind a box of old holiday decorations and unopened mail. A silent artifact from a version of her life that never came to pass. Then, one Monday morning, she came home from her usual walk before work to find something on her doormat. A plain white envelope. No name, no return address. Just her name, written in careful handwriting she hadn't seen in years. Emily. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. She didn't open it right away. She placed it on the kitchen table like it might explode. She stared at it over coffee, ignored it during her shower. Finally, she sat down, her fingers hesitating over the seal, and slid the letter out. The paper was thick, smooth, the handwriting unmistakable. Jason. The message was short. No greeting, no sign-off. Undyne. I would like to see you one last time. There are things you don't know. Things I should have told you long ago. If you're willing, please come. Beneath that was an address to a hospice facility on the outskirts of the city. Emily read it twice, 3 times. Her heart thudded in her chest like it was trying to claw its way out. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat there, staring at the letter like it was a ghost come to life. That night, Daniel noticed something was off. They were folding donation receipts in the office after hours, the quiet between them familiar but suddenly heavier. "You okay?" he asked softly. Emily hesitated, then nodded, then shook her head. "I got a letter." Daniel stopped folding, waited. "It's from him," she said. "Jason?" The name landed like thunder. Daniel's face didn't change, but something in the air shifted. "He's dying," she continued. "He wants to see me. Says there are things I don't know." Silence stretched between them, taut and uncertain. "You don't owe him anything," Daniel said finally, his voice gentle but firm. "I know," she whispered. "But I think I need to know." That night she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. She thought about the last time she saw Jason's face, his eyes full of something she had mistaken for love and then gone. She thought about the wreckage that followed, the way she had clawed her life back from the edge. But mostly, she thought about how it might feel to stand in front of him again. Not as the woman he left, but as the woman she had become. When the sun rose, she made her decision. She didn't tell Daniel right away. Didn't want him to talk her out of it. Or, worse, offer to come. This was something she had to do alone. 2 days later, she drove to the hospice. The building was quiet, surrounded by weeping trees and the smell of antiseptic. The nurse led her to a private room, her expression full of practiced sympathy. Emily's hands were ice cold. Jason was thinner than she remembered, his hair grayer, his skin pale and fragile. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment they simply stared at each other. "Thank you for coming," he said finally, his voice rasping. Emily sat in the chair beside him, every part of her rigid with tension. "I need to know," she said, "why you left, why you ruined everything." He closed his eyes, exhaled. "It wasn't because I stopped loving you." Her chest tightened. She wanted to scoff, to laugh bitterly, but she couldn't move. "I left because I thought I was protecting you." Then, slowly, haltingly, Jason told her the truth. About Victoria, about the fabricated pregnancy, about the threats to ruin Emily's career, about his family pressuring him to leave, to disappear, to protect their image and his future. "She had documents," he said weakly. "Emails, fake conversations, photos. They looked real." She said she'd go to the media, the police, your work. He looked at her then, eyes glassy. "I believed her. And I believed I was doing the right thing." Emily couldn't breathe. "You let me think it was me," she whispered. "You let me carry that for years." Jason didn't reply. He didn't have to. When she left the hospice that afternoon, the sky had darkened. Rain threatened, the air thick with storm. She drove in silence, her grip on the wheel tight, her heart a whirlwind of grief and rage and confusion. She didn't know what she was going to do with the truth. All she knew was this. Her past had found her, but this time she was strong enough to face it. The hospice room faded behind her as Emily stepped back into the crisp air, her heart hammering in her chest, her thoughts a maelstrom of memory and betrayal. The sun was bright, but it didn't warm her. Nothing could, not after what she'd just heard. Her feet moved on instinct, down the hallway, through the double doors, across the parking lot, until she was in her car, hands gripping the steering wheel, knuckles pale with pressure. Jason's words replayed in her mind, jagged and raw. "I thought I was protecting you," she said. "She'd ruin your career." I believed her. A lie spun from the mouth of a woman who had always lived above consequences, a family willing to sacrifice anyone in their orbit to maintain their image, and a man too weak to stand his ground. He had left her, not because he didn't love her, but because he didn't trust her strength, because he thought she couldn't survive a storm she had already endured. She sat there for a long time, letting the truth sink in, not just what he'd said, but the years he'd taken from her, years spent questioning her worth, rebuilding brick by fragile brick a life he had shattered. It wasn't just the pain of what happened. It was the injustice of it, the cowardice, the choice he made to vanish, to let her become a spectacle, to let her suffer alone while he slipped away to safety with his secrets. When she finally drove away, it wasn't home she went to. It was Maya's. Her best friend answered the door in sweatpants and no makeup, her brow furrowing at the sight of Emily's pale face. "What happened?" Maya asked immediately, pulling her inside. He told me," Emily said, barely above a whisper. She sat on the couch and unspooled it all, the letter, the visit, the confession. Maya listened, stone-faced, her hands clenched around a mug she never sipped from. When Emily finished, the room fell silent. "Had never told you?" Maya said at last, her voice flat with disbelief. "No," Emily whispered. "Not for 5 years." "That bastard," Maya muttered. But Emily didn't echo the anger. She didn't feel rage, only exhaustion. Like she'd been walking through a storm and just now realized how cold and wet she was. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I don't know how to carry this." "You don't have to," Maya said. "You don't owe him anything. You don't have to forgive him or go back or even think about him again. But Emily couldn't shake the heaviness pressing against her ribs. She had built a new life, one with purpose and grace and quiet strength, but this revelation was a thread, unraveling the story she had told herself to survive. If Jason had lied to protect her, then every moment of shame, every question of her own worth had been built on a foundation of silence. And now that silence was broken, and everything inside her felt exposed. She went home later that night, hoping the familiarity would ground her. Daniel was there, waiting in the kitchen, his eyes warm but watchful. Marcus was already asleep. Emily paused in the doorway, unsure of how to start. "I went to see him," she said finally, setting her keys on the counter. Daniel didn't react, just waited. "He told me everything. Why he left, what happened with Victoria." Daniel stepped closer. "Do you want to talk about it?" So she did. She told him every detail, voice shaking but steady. She told him about the threats, the forged evidence, the cowardice. She told him about the hurt, the kind that lived in her bones now, and about the hollow ache of realizing she had never been unworthy, just abandoned. When she finished, Daniel didn't speak right away. He took her hand, gently, his thumb brushing hers. "I'm sorry," he said, "that you carried this for so long, all by yourself." She blinked hard, the tears burning. "I thought I made peace with it. I thought I was over it." "Maybe you were," he said softly, "but now you know the truth, and that changes the shape of the wound." Emily exhaled slowly, leaning into his touch. "I don't know what to do with it." "You don't have to decide tonight," he said. "You don't have to forgive him. You don't even have to see him again. But whatever you choose, you're not alone." That night she lay beside him, staring at the ceiling. The weight in her chest felt heavier now that it had a name, a story. The silence she'd accepted for years had been replaced with truth. But it didn't feel like freedom yet. It felt like grief all over again. The next morning she told Daniel what she already knew. "I need to see him again," she said over breakfast, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug she couldn't bring herself to drink from. "I need to ask the rest." Daniel nodded, no hesitation. "Then do it." She returned to the hospice that afternoon. The room felt smaller this time, the air heavier. Jason looked worse. Sunken cheeks, shallow breaths. A shell of the man she used to know. His eyes flickered open when she entered. "You came back," he rasped. "I have questions," she said, "and I want answers." He nodded, too tired to pretend. She asked everything. About the documents, the lies Victoria spun, how his family reacted, why he let it happen. His voice was weak, but he told her everything. How Victoria had forged texts, created false paper trails, bribed someone inside Emily's office. How his father had threatened to cut him off. How his mother begged him not to marry scandal. How the choice felt impossible, but he made it anyway. "I thought I was protecting you," he whispered. "But I destroyed you instead." Emily stood there, trembling. "You didn't just destroy me," she said. "You erased me. You let me become a joke, a scandal, a headline, and you never once stood up for me." "I know," he said, tears glistening in his eyes. "I was weak." She stared at him, her hands clenched at her sides. "She wasn't pregnant, was she?" He closed his eyes. "No, it was all a lie." Silence filled the room, thick and stifling. When she finally turned to leave, he didn't stop her. He only whispered, I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know." Emily didn't look back. Outside, the sun was sinking behind the horizon, casting gold over everything. She walked slowly to her car, every step heavy with the weight of closure. But it wasn't closure, not yet. She still dreamed of the wedding sometimes, of the moment the glass shattered, of Jason's silhouette disappearing through the doors. But the dreams were quieter now, less like trauma, more like echoes. A few nights later, she told Daniel something she hadn't even admitted to herself yet. "I want to forgive him," she said quietly, curled up on the couch beside him. "But I don't know how." Daniel didn't offer advice, he just kissed her hand. "You forgive for yourself," he said. "Not for him." Emily nodded, the truth of it settling deep. The days that followed were quiet. She worked, she listened, she smiled more, not because everything was healed, but because she was learning how to carry it. One afternoon, while cleaning out a storage bin for the foundation's spring event, she found an old photo from her wedding day, one someone had slipped into her things before everything fell apart. She stared at it for a long time, herself in the center, dress flawless, eyes full of hope. A stranger. Later that night, she stood in front of the mirror, the photo in her hands. She studied the woman she used to be, the one who believed in forever without fear. Then she dropped the photo into the trash. The next morning, she made one last visit to the hospice. Jason was asleep when she entered, his breathing shallow. She sat beside him, resting her hand lightly on his. When his eyes fluttered open, she smiled faintly. "I forgive you," she said. He closed his eyes again, and for the first time, he looked at peace. She left without another word. Outside, the world felt different. Not lighter, but real. Honest. She had carried the weight of someone else's silence for years. Now, it was her own voice that set her free. The days after her final visit to the hospice unfolded in a strange, quiet rhythm. They didn't race past her in a blur the way trauma often did. Instead, they stretched long and slow, each moment unfolding with a deliberate weight, like the universe was allowing her to breathe again. But only just. Emily moved through them as if underwater. She worked, she smiled, she spoke. To anyone else, she probably looked steady, maybe even strong. But inside, everything felt suspended. She had made peace with the past, or at least she thought she had. But the truth lingered like the aftertaste of something bitter. She had said the words, "I forgive you," and in the moment, she meant them. But forgiveness wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. She sat in bed one night with Daniel asleep beside her, his breathing soft and even. The room was dark except for the soft amber glow of the hallway light spilling through the door. Emily stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She thought of how much effort it had taken just to say those words aloud, how heavy they'd been sitting on her chest for years, how light they'd felt when she released them. But she also thought of all the parts of herself that hadn't come back yet, parts that were still missing. Trust, joy, spontaneity, belief in love, not just as an idea, but as something she deserved. And perhaps, most painfully of all, she thought of the fact that she had spent 5 years building her life around a version of reality that hadn't been true. Jason hadn't left her because she wasn't enough. He hadn't walked away because she was unlovable or broken or unworthy. He had left because he was afraid. Of Victoria, of scandal, of fallout, of her strength. And yet, for years, she had believed the opposite. She had lived with that wound so long that healing felt unfamiliar. The following morning, Daniel found her standing on the balcony, wrapped in a blanket, barefoot despite the chill. He didn't ask what she was thinking. He just stepped beside her and handed her a cup of coffee, letting the silence stretch. After a long moment, she finally spoke. "Do you ever wonder if we live our lives based on the wrong story?" she asked. Daniel sipped his coffee, then nodded. "All the time." She looked at him. "I spent years believing I wasn't good enough, that he left because I didn't matter. And now, knowing the truth, it doesn't make me feel better, just confused." He leaned against the railing. "You rebuilt yourself based on what you thought happened, and that version of you, this version, is still real, still valid. But I feel like I'm living in the wrong chapter," she whispered. "Like the book rewrote itself, and now I don't know how to keep reading." Daniel reached for her hand. "Then start writing a new one." His words didn't fix everything, but they rooted themselves somewhere deep. Like seeds planted in soil she hadn't touched in years. She started thinking differently after that, not drastically, but enough to notice. She began walking to work instead of driving, letting the fresh air clear the cobwebs of sleep from her mind. She stopped ignoring Maya's calls when they came late at night and instead answered with a tired smile and a soft, "Hey." She stopped dodging conversations about weddings because, surprisingly, there was one on the horizon. Her own. She and Daniel hadn't made a spectacle of the engagement, no grand announcement, no party, just a quiet moment in the living room, their hands tangled together on the couch, Marcus already asleep in his room. Daniel had said, "I love you, and I want to build something with you. Something real." She had said yes with more calm than joy, but it was the kind of calm that came from choosing something solid, something safe, and that meant something. Their wedding plans were nothing like her first. There were no guest lists carefully curated to impress, no magazine-worthy venues, no champagne fountains or imported centerpieces. This time she wanted it small, real, intentional, a garden ceremony in the backyard of a friend's beachside inn. Just them, their families, Maya, a few close staff from the foundation, and Marcus, who insisted on giving a speech despite barely being able to say vow without giggling. For weeks everything went smoothly. Until the letter. It arrived one unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, tucked between bills and flyers. She might have thrown it out with the rest of the junk mail, if the handwriting hadn't caught her eye. It was the same as before, Jason's. But this time, it wasn't a plea. It was a goodbye. "I'm sorry I waited too long to explain. I'm sorry I didn't fight for you. I hope the man you've chosen treats you better than I ever did. I hope you find joy that isn't haunted. And I hope you forgive yourself, too. You didn't deserve what happened. You were never the broken one. I was." There was no return address. No signature, just those words. She folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She simply sat in her kitchen and let herself feel everything. Later that night, she showed it to Daniel. He read it silently, then handed it back to her. "Do you want to write him back?" he asked. She shook her head. "There's nowhere to send it." Daniel studied her for a long moment. "Then write it for you." So she did. She sat down that night and wrote Jason one final letter. Not to be mailed, not to be shared. Just to be written. She told him that she had loved him. Deeply, fully, naively. She told him that she had waited for him to return, and that when he didn't, she waited for herself to come back instead. She told him that his silence had nearly destroyed her, but that her own voice had saved her in the end. And she told him that she hoped he found peace wherever he was. She placed the letter in the same drawer as his, and for the first time in years she felt something loosen inside her. Not a release, exactly, but a shift, a quiet surrender. The week before the wedding, she returned to the hospice once more. Not to see Jason. He was gone now. Passed away quietly in his sleep, the nurses had said. No pain, no visitors. Just the quiet hum of machines and the final hush of breath leaving the body. Emily didn't go to the funeral. She didn't need to. Instead, she walked to the cliffside behind the hospice, where the sea met the sky in endless, churning waves. She stood at the edge, the wind whipping through her hair, and closed her eyes. "Goodbye," she whispered. She thought of the girl she had been when she first met him. Hopeful, wide-eyed, willing to believe in forever. She thought of the woman who had waited at the altar, heartbreaking as he walked away. She thought of every version of herself that had tried to survive what came next. And she let them go. The wedding came on a bright, quiet morning. The sky was a clear blue, the air crisp with the promise of spring. Emily stood barefoot in the small cottage by the sea, wearing a simple dress with lace sleeves and a strand of pearls Maya had given her for the occasion. Her hair was loose, curling softly at her shoulders. Outside, the garden buzzed with laughter and soft music. Marcus was running around in a too-big suit, trying to keep the rings from falling out of his pocket. Maya was already crying, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue and pretending she wasn't. When Emily stepped out, Daniel was waiting for her at the end of the aisle. She saw him, not through the haze of memory or the fear of history, but with clear, present eyes. He wasn't Jason. He wasn't a replacement. He wasn't a cure. He was the choice. Her choice. And when they stood together beneath the arch of wildflowers, hands entwined, hearts steady, she knew she wasn't walking into another fairy tale. She was walking into her own story, this time fully awake, fully alive, fully hers. The morning of their wedding was quiet in a way that felt sacred. No chaos, no last-minute emergencies. Just the gentle rustle of the ocean breeze and the low hum of birdsong drifting through the open windows of the seaside cottage they had rented for the weekend. Emily stood barefoot by the window, the soft wood floor cool beneath her feet, as she watched the sun rise over the waves. The sky bled soft gold and blush pink into the horizon, painting the water with the promise of something new. Everything about the day felt like a gentle exhale after years of holding her breath. Her reflection in the window caught her off guard. The woman staring back at her wasn't the girl who had once stood in a ballroom full of ivory flowers and candlelight, waiting for a man who would never come. That woman had been chasing a story she didn't write. This one, this Emily, had written her own chapters with blood and grit and grace. Her scars were still there, invisible but real, but they no longer defined her. They had become part of the architecture of her strength. Behind her, the room was warm with quiet activity. Maya was seated on the bed, her hair in loose waves, sipping coffee and occasionally dabbing at her eyes for no reason other than, as she'd said, "I'm just proud, okay?" A soft instrumental playlist played from a phone tucked into the windowsill. The scent of lavender floated in the air from a small candle burning on the dresser. On the chair beside the window hung Emily's dress. A simple ivory gown, soft and flowing, nothing like the elaborate masterpiece she'd once worn. She had chosen it deliberately. No corset, no heavy train, just something that moved with her. "I can't believe today's the day," Maya said behind her, her voice thick with emotion. "After everything—" Emily turned, smiling gently. "Yeah, after everything." She let Maya help her into the dress, their movements quiet and intimate. No photographers, no stylists, just two women who had walked through fire together and come out on the other side. Later, her mother arrived to clasp a delicate bracelet around her wrist, one Emily had never seen before. "It was mine," her mother said softly. "Not from my wedding, just from a time in my life when I chose myself, even when it was hard." Emily blinked back tears as she touched the cool metal. "Thank you." Outside, the guests were gathering. There weren't many of them, just close friends, family, a handful of colleagues from the foundation who had become something like kin. The garden of the inn had been transformed with wild flowers and soft string lights woven through the trees. A simple wooden arch stood at the end of the path, adorned with seagrass and white roses. It wasn't perfect, but it was beautiful. Daniel stood beneath the arch, his hands clasped in front of him, his suit slightly rumpled from where Marcus had tugged on it earlier, trying to straighten his tie. His eyes searched the space until they found hers, and then he smiled. A slow, warm expression that made her heart expand in her chest. As she stepped outside, her father offered her his arm. She took it without hesitation, her eyes never leaving Daniel's. The short walk to the altar felt surreal, not because she was afraid or uncertain, but because for the first time in her life, the story she was walking into felt entirely her own. When she reached Daniel, he took her hand and held it like it was the most natural thing in the world. The ceremony was brief but honest. They stood in front of their small circle of witnesses and exchanged vows they had written themselves. No lofty promises or flowery metaphors, just the truth. Daniel spoke first. "You once told me that you didn't know how to start over, that you weren't sure if you could love again. But loving you has never felt like starting over. It's felt like finally arriving. You are not a second chance, Emily. You are the only chance I ever wanted." Emily's throat tightened as she looked up at him. "I spent a long time thinking love had to be painful to be real, that I had to earn it, survive it, fight for it. But you taught me that love doesn't have to be a battlefield. Sometimes it's just a place to rest. And with you, I feel like I can finally stop running." There wasn't a dry eye in the garden by the time they finished. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel didn't wait for a cue. He simply leaned in and kissed her, his hands gently cradling her face, the world falling quiet for one sacred moment. The reception that followed was small and joyful. Children ran barefoot through the garden while music played from a vintage speaker someone had propped up on a table. Mason jars held wildflowers and tea lights. Plates of food were passed around with easy laughter, and Marcus gave his speech. Short and hilarious, ending with, "I guess now I officially have two parents who won't let me get a dog." Emily danced with her father beneath the canopy of lights, then with Maya, who spun her around until they were both laughing so hard they had to stop. Later, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, she found herself at the edge of the garden, the sea stretching out before her, endless and calm. She stood there for a moment, alone, letting the breeze lift her hair and the salt air fill her lungs. She thought of Jason, not with anger, not even with sorrow, but with a quiet sort of acceptance. He had been part of her story, a chapter marked by pain and silence. But he wasn't the end. She thought of the woman she had been then, young, hopeful, and unprepared for how brutal life could be. She thought of the years she'd spent gathering herself from the wreckage, the nights she'd wondered if she'd ever feel whole again. And now here she was. She didn't feel broken anymore. She felt forged, like steel shaped in fire, stronger for having survived. Behind her, Daniel appeared, his footsteps soft on the grass. He didn't say anything, just slipped his hand into hers. She looked up at him, her heart full. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "Yeah, I'm okay." They stood there for a while, watching the last sliver of sun disappear beneath the water. That night, after the guests had gone, after the candles had burned low and the stars had taken their place above the waves, Emily lay in bed beside her husband and closed her eyes. The world was quiet. The past had gone still. She wasn't haunted anymore. In the morning, she woke early again, just as she had the day Jason left her years ago. But this time there was no weight in her chest, no dread coiled in her stomach, only peace. The real kind, the earned kind. She got out of bed, wrapped herself in a robe, and padded barefoot out onto the balcony. The sea greeted her with its eternal hush, the sky just beginning to bloom with the colors of a new day. And when Daniel joined her, slipping his arm around her waist and pressing a kiss to her temple, she leaned into him with ease. No fear, no hesitation, just love. A quiet, steady kind of love that made her feel, finally, fully, completely free. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. Your presence means more than you know. Emily's journey reminds us of one powerful truth. Healing is not about erasing the past. It's about learning to live beyond it. Life will break us. People will disappoint us. But we always have the power to rebuild, not in spite of what happened, but because we chose to rise after it. Love that is patient, kind, and steady is always worth waiting for, and sometimes the most beautiful chapters are the ones we write after the storm. Where are you watching from? I'd love to know what corner of the world you're joining us from. Drop your city or country in the comments below, and if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. We share stories just like this, raw, emotional, and ultimately hopeful. Your support helps us continue creating content that speaks to the soul. Until next time, take care of your heart and never stop believing in second chances.